Hello, welcome, and thank you for joining us today. We are interviewing Essence McDowell, a co-founder of Lifting as They Climbed. And we're going to first do some introductions so you know who we are, the moderators. So my name is Dr. Brittany Gatewood. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at Albany State University Center for Educational Opportunity. And I'm joined by my colleague, Dr. Anthony Jackson, who is the adjunct professor at Prince George's Community College. And we're just going to be real informal, so Brittany and Anthony. But I'm going to pass it to Anthony, who's going to explain more about the project and why you all are here.
Yeah, so we are excited and have the pleasure of discussing the Mariame Kaba and Essence McDowell's project, Lifting as They Climbed, a self-guided tour that maps the history of Black women on Chicago's South Side. This project, and I quote, tells a story of Black women activists and artists who lived and worked on Chicago's South Side by taking readers on a tour of relevant landmarks and locations. So Brittany and I want to be intentional in this interview about centering you, Essence, this collaborative project, and the legacy and history behind activism in general, but particularly the lived experiences and resiliency of Black women. So without further ado, I'll pass it to you, Essence.
Thank you. I'm so honored and happy to be here and talking with you all. This project has evolved from a book to just a whole entire life path in a sense. And so I'm excited to share Lifting as They Climbed with you all and your audiences, and hope to share more about the importance of Black women's histories. Yeah.
So to learn more about Essence, I'm going to read a little bio to show how great she is. But Essence McDowell is a communication strategist, organizer, and co-author of Lifting as They Climbed, mapping a history of Black women on Chicago's South Side. She utilizes media, digital design, and communications technology to amplify the work of community institutions and justice-based organizations. Essence has worked with numerous national and local entities, including Illinois' Humanities Council, Chicago Torture Justice Memorials, Insight National, the Chicago Public Library, and Chicago's Teachers Union. She creates digital platforms, organizing tools, and impact strategies to facilitate social change. As an organizer, she has been a member of the All African People's Revolutionary Party, Black Youth Project, and Love and Protect, excuse me. She has served on the board of the Chicago Freedom School. In 2018, Essence wrote Lifting as They Climbed, mapping a history of Black women on Chicago's South Side, with organizer and educator Mariame Kaba. Due to the success of the publication, the two authors have signed with Haymarket Books to write an extended guidebook set to be released in the fall of 2022. Essence currently works as the Director of Communications at the Social Justice Initiative. She's currently collaborating with organizers in Chicago to develop a resource hub and toolkit for Black Women's Organizing Collective. So you have a long bio of great things. And so one thing that I really want to know is kind of how did you get into activism and advocacy work, right? What has been your inspiration? Where does your motivation come? And kind of where did this organizer that you are now started?
So it's been quite the journey. I'm originally from New Jersey, and so I came to Chicago to get my master's in communications at DePaul. And once I finished my master's, this is over a decade ago, I'm gonna age myself, but that's okay. After I graduated, I was like, when thinking about what's next and how to move forward, I really felt like I couldn't leave Chicago without really deeply understanding the communities that I was a part of, to really understanding the landscape of the city, the neighborhoods, to become entrenched in this lived experience versus just when you're in school, you're just in school and it's hard to kind of see a wider lens. And I thought that 10 years ago, and I had no idea what that really meant, but it was a feeling that I had. And so one of the first things I did outside of like, developing my career skills and building work experience was that I joined organizations. And Chicago is an excellent city for anyone who wants to be engaged in movement work. And I started just by like, what did I feel connected to? I was raised in a very African-centered household. And so the first organization that I joined, which I'm currently still a member of, is the All African People's Revolutionary Party. And it is a Pan-African socialist organization. And it really, I think, opened my eyes to the importance of his history in understanding the present. And a lot of the work of the organization is to read and to continue learning. And also just as a part of my own life path, I'm constantly a learner. I constantly want to learn more and understand more about the world around me. And that begins with, I think, an African-centered history, but also just goes into Black history in really important ways. And so those things come together to like this importance of learning our history. And then it's, okay, so to better understand the present, if you understand the present, then activism and I think organizing was the natural next step for me, because it was like, I understand these present conditions and I understand the history that contributed to them. So then what? And what am I going to do? And how do I get involved? And so the organizations that I've been a part of over this past decade have lended to my level of understanding and my commitment to our communities. And that then led me to this text, Lifting as They Climb.
So one thing I heard you say is you have a very let's say internal motivation to learn more about the community, be entrenched in the community, and help uplift the communities that you live in at the time. And so one thing especially we see in this moment of everything that's going on in society is that there's a lot of protests, a lot of organizing activism, but like most social movements, some of it's short-lived, right? They ebb and flow and die out. And so you, as a long time, advocate or activist, whichever you want to describe yourself as, an organizer, what has motivated you to keep going all these years, right? Because people will go to one protest and then they will never go to another, or they would join one organization and then they will leave. And so what has encouraged you and been your motivation to push throughout, the years that you have been trying to advocate and being part of these community organizations?
I think just a love of our community, a love for our people. I don't know. I've been thinking about it a lot lately, because the pandemic allows us to really get introspective and understand why we're doing what we're doing and how we're doing it. And I think it's just, I love us. And I've seen throughout history all of the ways in which we have been resilient, and the ways that we've created when we've had very little to create with. And that, I think, is a motivating factor. As far as my current organizing work, it's really moved by the needs of the movement in the moment. I'm currently working with a coalition to protect Black girls, because a young 10-year-old girl in Chicago was sexually assaulted by multiple men, really failed by the police department and the city, and Child Protective Services also failed this little girl. And so I'm doing this coalition work because it's a structural issue, that allowed this young Black girl to just be harmed in so many ways. And so it's just I think these moments where it's just always work to do. There's always some injustices to explore, to learn more about. And then to me, I'm a communication strategist. I have a love for digital language, for graphic design, and all of those things kind of come together in how I work with organizations. So it's like, I'm trying to build out a website for protectblackgirls.org to amplify the ways in which young Black girls are unprotected in the city. And so at every different moment in my life, when I think about my engagement with organizations, it's because there's so much need for us to really protect Black women and girls, to protect Black communities, to provide resources. And it's just a never ending cycle. So even when the national news or the media isn't focusing on what the conditions in Black communities are, that doesn't mean there's still not a lot of work to be done. And if my values are connected to supporting these communities and connected to uplifting Black women and girls, or just our people as a whole, then I have to constantly be engaged in that work. And so that's kind of what's kept me going through, because there's just never a lack of need for us to be engaged in the work.
I, I, that resonates with me so much, because I think that there's so many demands in life in general to just live. But the thing about it is, Black people are their main focus, our main focus is trying to survive, and living becomes a luxury. And it seems like that when we start talking about these exploitative things and the nature of oppression and how it's intensifying, it sometimes we feel stifled in our ability to grow in all of these different ways. And so being actively engaged in this movement is like very important. And you uplift the significance of history. Marcus Garvey said, people without knowledge of their past history, origins, and cultures, like a tree without roots. And so for you to have that understanding and then being actively engaged in these communities is super important. And so I first of all, I just want to say thank you for the work that you do. And I think I'm uplifting you even more is so important for Black women, right, to be in these spaces. I think that when we start talking about these movements and how, you know, we will be in here protesting for Black men, it's like Black women sometimes are left in the shadows. And so to hear you echoing the voice of Black women is super important. So when you start thinking about, or when we start thinking about lifting as they climbed, when we talk about the history of Chicago, I guess, why was it so important to uplift the history of Black women, right, and lifting as they climb? And what were the overall themes and messages that you wanted to uplift in general?
Yeah, so thank you for that. It's Lifting as they climbed has been this year. This we published in 2018, so it's been quite a few years that I've recognized like how much these stories are needed. Over the past couple of years, I've had the opportunity to engage with the text in different ways. So like originally it was community, taking folks on tours. The second phase, I think, was really going into schools and getting a better idea around what is the status of history and how are our children being taught history. And I think that second phase really highlighted for me why it was important that we talked about these Black women's histories, because the mainstream historical narratives, that that's actual textbooks that our children are learning from, completely erase the importance and the significance and the contributions of Black women. And when I stood in many schools, southwest side of Chicago, north side of Chicago, I realized that these young people didn't have any ideas around who, outside of this dominant narrative of, you know, of course, with all due respect, you know, Rosa Parks and Harriet Tubman and Michelle Obama. They didn't understand that there were so many more Black women who just did so much, you know? And so originally this was a project that Miriam Kaba, who was a dynamic educator and organizer, had started, as I believe she just has been doing research for 20 or some odd years prior to me stepping into the project. But she presented it as an idea to a small group of women and asked like who wanted to kind of move forward with it. And from there, what occurred to me was when she was talking about these stories is that I actually needed to know more about Black women's history. And myself, as someone who has studied history and I have a love of history and Black history, specifically African history as well. It's just like, I just felt like I didn't know enough. And as we began to do the research and uncover more and more and more Black women artists, organizers, institution builders, it was clear that this is just a area that's so rich with information, and that even I had walked past locations in Chicago that I didn't know was connected to those histories, you know? And so it's so many reasons why it was important for us to do this that are constantly highlighted throughout this journey for me. But it's just in a very plain way, like American history erases the contributions of Black people as a whole. And so there's so many gaps for us to fill in, and there's so much of a need for us to create resources that speak to that history. And with Lifting as They Climbed, it was also important that it wasn't just a traditional text, right? Like it's not like a really extensive history book. It's not like really heavy, you know, it's not all of the women's stories are summarized into these brief snippets, these pages that we connected, but it's so much more, but we want it to be accessible. We want it from young people to elders to anyone to be able to understand that these histories are alive and vibrant today. And that we also wanted there to be this importance of a geographical history, of a communal history. So when you take the book, the idea is it's a guidebook. So you take the book and you go, let's say, on King Drive in Chicago, which is, thank you so much, which is like a main boulevard in Chicago, which has a rich history on its own. And when you walk down the street, you're able to understand not only what these women built, what movements they were a part of, but also that this street right here that you are experiencing in 2021, right, it has this great history that is present right now, that these buildings that are there, you can touch and you can feel and you can see. So I think that the kind of threads that we were trying to tie in is Black women's history. How does that relate to place? And how does that relate to a communal history? And also, how does that also connect to a larger untold story around Black women's contributions to this nation? So we try to do all of those things at once, but it's just important for young and old, all intergenerational folks to understand how Black women built this city, built this nation, and how that relates to our present day today.
Brittany, before we move on, I have a follow-up, because so when you start talking about the significance of history and time and place, right? Can you speak to us about like the whitewashing of history and the strategies behind this miseducation? How does this dispel myths that Black folks haven't accomplished anything, and the myth that Black folks haven't been actively engaged in abolitionist revolutionary struggles? How does this book and the work that you do in general help dispel this?
I mean, I think that I'm really just entering, and I feel like a novice in certain ways because there's so many historians that have done this work across centuries. And so the myth is really just a miseducation, right? The myth is that someone did not do research, so they're making these blatant statements, these stereotypes around Black people and Black history, when in fact that if you did any kind of research, you went to a library, you picked up the history of Chicago, that there is so much information out there that says that we were engaged in an abolitionist struggles before there was an abolitionist movement, right? We were engaged in building institutions even before the Emancipation Proclamation. I think that was one of the most powerful pieces to me, to discover that some of these women that we feature in Lifting as They Climbed, they were formerly enslaved women who then came to Chicago and said, I see these deficits in our, social support services. I see these deficits in what we need to sustain health and well-being. And we're going to come together and build these things. We're going to contribute to these things. And so that one of the earliest women that we speak to in the book, Mary Jane Richardson Jones, she's coming into it in the 19th century, right? And it was like in Chicago, before there was the Great Migration, there were Black communities here. And there's just so much of a story around what they were doing and what they were building, and how they were engaged in suffragist struggles, and how they were engaged in abolitionist struggles just in the 1800s. I was like, this is amazing, right? And so I don't know whether I'm like, there's this direct, like, I'm going to dispel this, but there's an uplifting of all of this research and all of this work that has already been done. And all we have to do is provide the venues and provide the trajectories for us to just see history, to see the facts. This is facts, right? We're not making this up. This is historical evidence that's in text, that's in archives, that all we have to do is just reach back and pull those texts and pull these archives out and just kind of uplift the things that have already been done. And so, I mean, this I think move that has been going on for centuries to erase Black history it has not worked, and it's not going to work, especially as we have access to multimedia, as we build, create documentaries and write more books, that it's impossible to erase us because we're here and there's so much evidence of that presence.
Yeah, and speaking about the history and the whitewashing, of history. In the introduction in the book, just talking about what the landscape even was, right? So people, when you think about, and I've even asked students, right? It's like when you think about, 50s, 60s or whatever, Black people in Chicago, Detroit, or the Midwest, it's like Great Migration, ghettos, and that's all they know, right? They don't know anything else about that. But you're talking about Brownsville community, that it was this cultural center. And one thing that I really love about this book and the women is the fact that we, especially when talking about Black women in history and talk about Black women in general, it's always about the labor that we produce and the labor that we do. Like, we're activists, we work in the community, we're uplifting people, but you also highlighted artists, you highlighted singers, and just like the beauty of what a Black woman could be. We always don't have to be, passing out flyers, we always don't have to be doing that, feeding people, but we also produce such beautiful art, musicians and everything else. So it's a very well-rounded approach. And it's the fact of, their art, and I've always believed this, like, as soon as a Black woman wakes up, we're resisting, right? Everything we do in life, we're resisting. And so I love that you have multiple groups of people, and if people do take the tour, you'll see that there's artists and writers, music, and then Ida B. Wells, who's a force upon herself, has her own thing, which I appreciate. But one thing I want to know is, why these people? Like, how would you pick these people? And I know you said Miriam was doing research prior to, but like, why these 33 sites? Why are these people that you chose to be in this first iteration of this book?
So ultimately, it was a hard struggle to decide who goes into the text. But because we decided we wanted this book to be a guidebook, it's a very unique niche. So most of these stories had to be connected to land and place in Chicago community, specifically land and place on Chicago's community South Side. And so in order to get the whole full rich experience, right? This whole embodied experience as you're standing on the land that they built in front of these institutions that they created, then you better understand the lives that they lived because of the legacy that they left behind. And so when we were narrowing down the list, we had to narrow down based on who we could situate. And there's really, what this also becomes is like, there's so many things that this project could lead you to. And it could also lead you to understanding that there have been so many important historical places that have been torn down. We include the Negro Fellowship League. Ida B. Wells had, a settlement house in the same way that Jane Addams it's the Jane Addams house as well, right? Like, this was a settlement house where, folks could go in and have a library, could go get job resources, could also have a place to sleep, things like that. But the Negro Fellowship League no longer exists, and it's not there. So we try to, in some locations, still keep that. So you stand there and understand, this is such an important institution that she built. Why is it not there? Same for like Ada S. McKinley, right? Like, she was a social service provider. She actually still has social service centers around the state 100 years later. But the original Southside Community Center that she built is no longer there, right? So we were just trying to narrow down these names by the place and the stories that we could tell. And we also didn't include everyone because we wanted this project to be inspirational. And we wanted people who read these snapshots, read these pages of these women's lives and felt inspired to do more research, felt inspired to understand who else is not included. This is 48 Black women when there's hundreds and hundreds of women who have contributed to this history. And so it wasn't by any means an easy process to reduce down to 48, but it was also a lot of considerations about place, in these geographical narratives and these community narratives that we could tell through these women's lives. And it's so rich. It's so rich. So we hope, like, when people were standing there, that they'd say, like, and what about my neighborhood? What about, this is what we heard when we were doing talks. Folks would always say, Essence, what about the West Side? And then we're like, exactly, what about the West Side? We're not saying by any means that we're creating this expansive historical narrative, that we're just choosing a location so that feeds the thirst and helps people understand. And if we were able to find 48 women on the South Side only, then there's hundreds in the city of Chicago, in New York and California, everywhere, you know. And I also want to speak to you when you mentioned, you know, it's not, Black women are not just, you know, organizing and laboring. And what I found, which was so beautiful, was that even the women who were artists, they were connected to activism. You know, I think about Etta Moten. Etta Moten is a performer. She was also, you know, she was an actress. And she was well known, you know, before we think about like well-known performers who were on mainstream media, really dispelling these notions about what Blackness looked like. She was also engaged in, you know, the DuSable Museum, and also engaged in activism with the Southside Community Arts Center. And so they all did so much. This is why in the book we have their lives, and then we also have the institutions that they were connected to and the organizations that they were connected to, because even when they were doing arts, they were doing activism. And even when they were like, you know, like creating literature, they were also engaged in community in different ways. And so it was just like this multifaceted existence that they lived. And that I think that the different ways were almost inherently tied together, that you couldn't necessarily explore arts without understanding the conditions of these people in these communities. And so it was such an overlap, and their lives were so inspirational in the way that they did that. It was just so, I think, so magical to me. Not that they did the one thing or two, but they did all of these things. And then they were mothers, and then they were, you know, family sisters, and like contributed to their households. It just, you know, and this is what we still do. You know, we still have to engage in art as healing, and we still have to then go out to work and labor. It's just so much that we do, but how do we take care of ourselves and our communities at the same time is almost something that we couldn't ignore, you know?
Yeah, and one thing I really love talking about this history of Chicago, right? You want people that are on the South Side, like, what about the West? You know, what about all these other places? Is the fact of, and it just made me think of these places where, especially white women activists, their locations are celebrated, right? Susan B. Anthony's place, like all these places are celebrated, but all the Black women's spaces are gone, right? And so even, you know, we lose a connection to the land when we don't even know where it was, right? We can't even go to a place. We have to look in the archives, figure out where can we even stand to be on the land of our ancestors. And so the fact that this tour is kind of opening our minds to, like, you know, Southside Chicago isn't just this Chirac, right? Like this notion of what Chicago is actually a very vibrant place that has a very rich activism that's outside of Fred Hampton and outside of these people that we already know. And so it's a, you know, a very good way to connect the land to our ancestors and to what we even know about the women that were there. And, you know, you have all these sites. So is there one site that is just like, this is your favorite? This is the one you will talk up. Like, I love, like, this is my girl, this is my woman. Like, is there a site that is just like, you love, like, that's your favorite?
I try to not say my favorite. I try to like steer away from saying my favorite because just because of all of the women that deserve that acknowledgement. But I think I always get caught up with this question because I'm like, oh, I know, you know, the first thing that I naturally want to say, but no, there's no particular site. I think that there's buildings that I think deserve restoration today. You know, there's this movement right now to save the Phyllis Wheatley home. It was a space that Elizabeth Lindsay Davis helped to found, and as a space that provided support for Black women and girls coming up through the Great Migration, who needed, like, you know, support. They needed economic resources. They needed to be able to develop, you know, ways in which they could build careers and lives. And so there's these settlement houses, I think, are really important historical monuments to not just one area, right? It's health and social services and education. And so there's right now has been this fight to preserve the Phyllis Wheatley home. It was on a chopping block in Chicago, like they were going to demolish this building, right? But if we don't know, what the contributions were, as Elizabeth Lindsay Davis was, she was a pioneer in the Black Women's Club movement, and also created plenty of organizations and coalitions to support Black women and girls in the city. If we didn't know her history, right? If we didn't know about her, then we would think that building, it's okay to tear it down, And so this is kind of some of the things that we're trying to go up against by telling these stories, is to say, like, you would never be able to protect something you don't understand the historical importance of. And so we're hoping that these stories also protect the spaces that are still left. There's even some, I think that the original DuSables Museum was started in Margaret Burroughs' home. And people, we have the institution, but the home also should stay. As I was talking about Ada S. McKinley, right? Like the Southside Community Center was tore down to be for IIT. IIT is this university in Chicago. That campus exists, right? You're standing in the middle of their campus, but all they have is a small marker. And so I think that, to me, this also became like a project where if I had a bunch of lifetimes, I would now become an advocate for the reclamation of land and how we create monuments in the spaces and how we protect the buildings that meant so much to Black history and Black life. Even Lorraine Hansberry's childhood home needs restoration, right? But if people don't step onto that house that's like on a block that's nondescript, right? It's a house, it's a regular block, but to understand that Lorraine that she's so important to our cultural history that we should preserve this house. This house also represents redlining and segregation in that community during the time. And so we have to just know this information in order to protect the land, in order to protect the buildings and the spaces that speak to that history. So I hope I answered the question. I might have veered off a little bit, but.
No, you did. And so this protection of, restoration of these places, of the land, and I think you talked about, even in the beginning, about Black girls, right? Protecting Black girls. And what do you see this project as for Black girls, right? What do you want them to get out of this project? What do you want from them to see or be inspired by? Like, how does this connect to your passion of the protection of, Black girls and their youth?
Man, I think that's a question that really speaks to my work and my heart in a lot of ways, especially the ways in which Black girls are not as protected, and experience certain levels of violence, hypersexualization, like they're not allowed to experience their girlhood in ways that, little white girls get to experience. And so, I just hope that the book just serves as an inspirational text. And as someone who was formerly a little Black girl, I read these stories and I felt really deeply, motivated to explore many areas of my life, in the same way that I was speaking to earlier, that if I felt, kept out of the publishing industry, right? That I could read some of these stories and feel inspired to create my own, my own work, my own publishing company, right? Like there's so many ways of if you feel like your niche is not being met, if you feel like your art is not being respected, that then we can create amongst ourselves so much of our own platform, so much of our own bolstering in our communities. And then also just the ways that we can live full lives, in the face of such racism, in the face of many of these women coming up from the Great Migration, trying to escape the South and the harms of the South and the violence of the South, came here looking for new opportunities, and they created them themselves. And so our challenges aren't new. Our challenges aren't new, unfortunately. The ways in which Black women and girls are unprotected is centuries old. But I think what the book speaks to is what we can build in spite of that. what we can do with our lives, despite the obstacles and despite the harm that's constantly coming at us, that we can still live full lives and we can still create and build and imagine solutions and liberation in so many different formats. And so I don't know whether they could get it all. And if nothing else, then I want them to know that you come from a lineage of Black women that is so strong. It's so strong. Like there's so many of us that across all types of industries across all types of communities and all types of geographical sectors, that we are creators, right? Like we have so many women that if you feel uninspired, that you could just reach to some of these pages and reach into history and find a woman that can speak to your story and that can help you navigate current problems, And so history is not so far away. For our young Black girls, it's actually a part of our present. And it's a way that we can use history as a tool to kind of uplift us and inspire us and protect us in some ways, So, it is a heart piece to me. Because when I stood in those schools and I asked them, how many women can you name after we exhaust this list of 10 that are constantly, overemphasized, and they didn't have any, I wanted them to know, like, this is just 48. And in your community, you can go back and say, even to your family, you can ask your mom, like, what about my great great grandmother, and be inspired by that history that's connected to you, that's connected to your lineage, And so, I just hope that book does some of that work to uplift Black girls and let them know that the possibilities are absolutely endless in the face of all that's coming at you to attack you.
Oof, that was deep. I always think about from listening to you what Malcolm X famously said, the most disrespected person in America is the Black woman. The most unprotected woman in America is the Black woman. The most neglected person in America is the Black woman. And I think about how Black women are so multidimensional. And as a Black man, I've learned that it is important to do what we can to uplift the voices of Black women who are often left unheard or heard and then invalidated. And sometimes that just looks like shutting up. So I feel like I'm so nervous by like listening to y'all. And I think this is such a powerful dynamic. And when you were talking about how the multidimensionality of Black women cannot be compartmentalized into these two different spaces. I'm either this, a mom, or I'm either this, an activist. I'm either this, an artist, or I'm either this, a revolutionary, and how it's all one and the same. And so I guess I wanted to talk about how has the community responded to this, right? Like, how has the community responded to this tour? What type of energy were you all met with?
Man, I acknowledge that there has been nothing but support, that we self-published Lifting as They Climbed. Miriam and I, put our skills together and our coins together, and then we self-published this book. And so it didn't have a big institutional, like, financial backing that every book that is sent out, like I'm hand mailing, so, but all of these years later, there's not a month or a week that goes past that somebody is not still buying this book. And I could get teared up, I could totally get teared up when I think about just how much support has come from communities in Chicago, around the nation. Like, people, like, I'm still just like, we get requests from like Nebraska, California. I'm like, this book is going around the nation still in 2021. That even in Chicago community, folks are taking a tour. I met this young researcher. She just this year is taking folks out into the community with the book and buying copies to give away to folks who want to learn more about Black women's histories in Chicago. There's just resounding support, endless support from librarians who brought me in to speak in the libraries of Chicago, to teachers who have still used this as a resource, that want to take their students out on class trips. I've gotten the opportunity to just be with educators and go to these sites and kind of speak to these histories. And so there's this never ending tsunami of support from our communities, which I could have never imagined. When I took this project on with Miriam, I just felt, I felt this very overwhelming, holistic call to do the project. And I didn't know what it was about. But I look now, all of these years later, and still sending books out, still getting orders, still having conversations like this because of how important these women's histories are, how important Black women's history is to this nation as a whole. And so the support is unending. It's unending. And I couldn't have fathomed it. I think we just did this book in such a pace that I just never thought, like, 2-3 years later, that the book would still be selling, that we would still have so much interest, that people would still be going outside into these tours. I think it just speaks to not just this book's importance, but just the importance writ large of how Black women are understood in the depths of history, and how we're understood within our communities, and the locations that are so important, that speak to these contributions that we have made decade after decade, century after century. And so I just want to say thank you to everybody who's constantly still just like inspired by the text and showing us creative ways. A little girl, also this little girl had to do a Women's History Month project. And we have coloring pages on our website to help little young people get active and understand histories through coloring, And she did this beautiful board. And it was just like, it was so incredible to see her like hold up this beautiful painting, this colored portrait, and just have like this conversation about Black women's histories. And she's so little, I think she was in elementary school. It's like that kind of thing that comes out of nowhere this March, where it's just so much going on in the world, that just that little light that you get to see. Catherine Dunham is who she did. I was trying to wrap it around Catherine Dunham. She did a whole presentation on, and that we include her in her book as a dancer and a performer. And just little things like that just keep me inspired and that keep me connected to this work. And I didn't know it was a lifetime project, but apparently it is. And I'm honored to be a part of it.
So what do you, so considering just the cultural depth and everything, you talked already really about my question. I was going to ask, how has this project really just made you feel? And obviously, like, I see like you're radiating like with so much like energy, and I appreciate that. And to hear that story about the little baby, like that is like, oh, that's what we do it for. You know what I'm saying? How did you think this project will turn out, and what were like challenges that you ran into, like doing it?
I think that, a lot of times when I engage in work, especially in 2017, when I was working on this project, I wasn't, it's not that long ago, but it feels like lifetimes ago, that I'm not necessarily thinking about what it does in the world, that you do it and you put it out there because it's needed, and then what it does is a gift to you, and so I couldn't have fathomed what it would do. And I think the only challenge I experience is like, Miriam and I have, like, Miriam is in New York, and she just published her own book and is doing so much incredible work around abolition. And I am also living, I'm full-time director of communications and also still organizing. And so that the only limitation that I've experienced is just, it's one of us, it's one of me, it's one of her. And this project, because of the way that it has evolved over the past couple of years and the way that it still has impact, I just wish that I was able to like give more, that I was able to give more to it, that I was able to live another life, like clothe myself in order to just do it justice, because this work can be, it can just be so much, right? Like, it can be so many different projects. I wish that I can go to each side of Chicago to really fully capture Black women's contributions in our communities. I wish I could go to New York and, California, Oakland, New Jersey, where I'm from, to be able to do a more thorough accounting of the landmarks that speak to Black women's history. And so I think the only challenge is just, life funding. If someone wants to give $1 million to this project, we would love that, and help us train some docents to go out into community to do these tours. I may not, as outside opens up and people start to go outside, want to do safe distancing, still safe activities, that taking tours is a really excellent thing, an excellent way to be outside, and to also kind of learn and experience at the same time about Black women's geographies and histories. So I just wish there was more money and more time and more resources and a whole team of people that can bring this to life. And that challenge is also just a possibility in itself. And that as I speak that, I know, you put it out there in the world and you have no idea how it comes back. So, hopefully we publish the extended version for the West Side, and then that sparks a whole nother different level of engagement, and that folks still, as they're doing now, take the project and go into their communities and learn more. I had young people like, I'm going to learn about Humboldt Park, and I'm going to learn about my family's contributions in Humboldt Park because of the book. So I just hope that it continues to spread organically. Really, we don't have marketing dollars behind it, and to still see it reverberate in such a way. The challenges are really just reflections of the abundance that this book has offered.
Mm-hmm. So one thing you were talking about was that you're surprised people keep buying this book, right? It's been out a couple of years. You're like, oh, I still got orders. But I think it's not that many of these, right? Like, there's not that many accounts of just what Black women have contributed to American history, right? Like, not even Black history, not even that. This is America's history. And it shows that it's such a need, right? We want these things, right? We want to digest them, to know about where we come from, to know about these powerful people, because, we are devalued in all these things on everyday life. But no, we got the Ida B. Wells, we got all these people, we got Roberta Martin, we got all these people that done all these amazing things, like, so I think that's why this has been such it's going to go on, right? You're going to get calls all the time for the rest of the time. So you set yourself up for this. But one thing I wanted to ask is, because especially with this interview, this is going to be shown to a bunch of academics, right? And academics especially are a whole bunch of white liberal people, particularly, and not just liberal, but all in between. And so what kind of message would you want them to know about this project, right? What do you want those, people that are making the policies, that make the research about us, right? We Black people doing research about Black people is looked frowned upon, right? So all the things about Black people are usually by white authors. And so what do you want your message to be to these people that are in these seats, have these powers, even these dollars? What do you want them to know from this?
I have this complicated relationship with the Academy, and I go back and forth with my place in it as an academic in certain senses of the word. But I love the space that is solely dedicated to the intellectual production of brilliance, right? Like, of thinking and thought and reading and learning. I'm a bibliophile, it's just all wrapped up in there. But I was in this workshop this weekend, Black Feminist Futures put together as Canon. It was a workshop that highlighted some really powerful Black feminist scholars. So Saidiya Hartman and Joy James were there. And what I love about both of them and how they presented the work is that, especially Saidiya Hartman, I'm such a stan for her writing, right? Because she's taking these really important histories, and specifically around Black women and girls, and writing in a way that's so, it's like it's a world. She's building a world with her language, right? Like, and there's so many times where I love words, right? Like, I'm a writer, so I can sort through the dense academic text, and I could get engaged and inspired. But I think that our real impact is larger than that. In that, when you're a part of these institutions, you're kind of speaking a language that's only to certain academics, right? Like these, like, and because I've been in it for so many years that I understand it and I can speak with it. But I think the real work for me has been understanding that these Lifting as They Climbed came from a bunch of like really dense historical texts, and we made it accessible, right? Like I think the goal is to, or I'm not saying it should be for everyone, right? Because you have your own life path. But what's really important is like, how do we get these really important theories? How do we take that and distill it down into a communal level? How do we take these ideas and notions around, historical narratives? How do we take these structures, these intellectual structures, and break it down to so that it's digestible on a neighborhood level? Like, I think that there's ways in which we create language and we create resources, but it can't translate. It doesn't translate into to young people. It doesn't translate to folks who don't have degrees. And I'm more concerned about if we care about our communities, instead of just writing about them or theorizing about them, that we have to figure out how to connect to those communities and how to contribute to those communities. And so I'm really thinking and interested in projects that do that work. As a communication strategist, of course, I'm biased because I'm thinking about accessibility. I'm thinking about how do we take, some of these academic texts and create visual representations of them so that they become then tools for organizers and tools for educators that are teaching a broad range of demographics. So I would say, for academics, of course, you live in this very siloed world, right? The institution is really, they can kind of be kind of narrow in their scope of who it reaches. But as someone who cares about the constituents that they're doing the research on, that then how do you make this work legible to others who don't have the degrees and don't have all of the, I think, educational privilege to be able to engage in the ideas on a certain level. So I think the work is the work to me specifically, and with this book, in other projects that I do, is like, how do I morph that into a communal tool, right? How does it then become something that contributes to the folks that I care the most about? And I think that's a really big part of my life work. Like I'm thinking about that all the time. Even with the All African People's Revolutionary Party, we're reading The World in Africa by Du Bois. And, it's a dense text, but what he's talking about so much is the world's engagement with Africa and what that looked like, and how enslavement impacted that, and how trade impacted that. And if I could take that resource and like chop it down to something that, 11th graders, 10th graders, 9th graders, 8th graders could also understand, I think that would just be so incredible, So that's what I'm thinking about when in talking to academics, is just how does your work translate into a community? Like, how does your work impact those who are most vulnerable? How does your work speak to, how can your work even be engaged by those who don't have a degree and don't have a PhD and don't have a master's? And, if you really are thinking about change in a large scale way, I think that the consideration to how we translate our work into those communities is important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so because Anthony and I always have that in the back of our minds, right? Like, how can you bridge the gap between the community and the ivory towers? Like, because you have such a price tag on education, right? But some of the smartest people I know don't have any degrees, right? And so also talking, kind of lifting up what you're saying, is also the value of teaching this to 11th graders, right? Teaching this to the kids and making it accessible, because it's their history too, right? Like, we try to trademark it for us. I need to write a book, I need to do this, but no, this is all of our history. We all need to collectively educate each other. And, instead of this, capitalist mindset of what education looks like. And so one question I know we didn't ask is, why is it called Lifting as they climbed? Like, why is that the name of this project? Like, did you come up with it, Demariam? Like, how did this name, and what does it mean to you? And has that meaning changed since you originally wrote this?
Hmm. Well, what I want to say, no, we did not come up with it. Well, not in a sense. This is actually lifting as we climb. I think it's Elizabeth Lindsay Davis wrote a book about the women's club movement and about Black women organizers. She did that, I believe, in the 20th century. She published that book, and it's such a powerful text that I would encourage everyone to look into. So we are kind of building off that. Elizabeth Lindsay Davis being someone who largely contributed to the Black Women's Club movement. Black women's clubs were the ways in which Black women gathered in the 20th century and formed like organizations to provide support to their communities. And sometimes it was also just social gatherings and things like that, but they were organizing, they were gathering and connecting with one another in these clubs, which is the Black Women's Club movement, which that was a very synthesized version of what they did. So she wrote a text that encompasses that work, and Black women's clubs were around the nation, really impactful in communities and what they contributed and the resources they were able to help provide. So we didn't come up with the name out of the blue. It is in homage to that. And also what we recognize in these women's stories is that they were educators and scholars, they were organizers and artists, and what they did largely is use that passion in those particular areas to take others with them, to provide, for the needs of their communities. So they were literally lifting as they climbed, and their climbs were challenging, right? Their climbs were up against Jim Crow, their climbs were up against enslavement and all different types of lynching, and it just so many forces. But while they were combating all of that, they were making sure that their communities had what they need and their neighbors had what they need. Like it was just, they literally embodied lifting as you climb, right? And to answer did the book name, like the way we thought about the book's name, change to my present day, is just, I think that to me is a call to my own work, right? Like, how am I lifting others up? How am I committed to this work in real ways? How am I constantly creating resources, being engaged in projects and programs and coalitions that are seeking to lift, others up, that are seeking to protect others, that are seeking to destroy systems that are harmful, so I'm trying to embody that in my work, in the same ways that these 48 women in Lifting as They Climb did, in so many ways, so I don't know, I know that that's a lifetime project, that's many lifetimes, but in maybe, 30, 40, 50 years from now, if I have the pleasure to still be on this planet, then I would have a better idea about what that looked like. But I know that from writing this book that I'm inspired to do that and continue that work.
So in just wrapping up, I think we have to mention the website, ChicagoBlackWomenTour.com. And the book talks about, you going on a tour. And if you want to add and talk about the history, this is an avenue to do. And I think that's very important. And that brings me to the last thing. What can we do to help this whole process, right? Like, what can we do to help uplift the voices of Black women? What can we do to uplift as we continue to climb through our respective struggles? Like, what can we do, like, to support?
Yes, so thank you so much. It's ChicagoBlackWomenTour.com, and also LiftingAsTheyClimb.com will lead you to the site that we created for the book that has resources, a playlist, coloring sheets, mini tours that help you kind of navigate these different, to connect tour sites if you wanted to, and navigate the book in a particular way. It's just an overarching resource. So if you're not in Chicago and you wanted to kind of get an interactive feel, then definitely visit the site. And I think what we can do is, I think on a micro level, on a macro level, on an individual level, I think care for the Black women in your community. Take special care for and support of those who are in your family. when I think about a lot of the harm Black women and girls experience, is actually in the household. And so it doesn't have to be on this really like incredible scale on an intellectual, it could actually just be in your relationships, and how are you using those relationships to I think to bolster and live out the values that you have. And if you care about Black women, that means you care about them, all that, the ones that are around you, the ones that you engage with and come into contact with. And I think on a macro level, like zooming out a little bit, how do we share these stories, you know, whether it's Lifting as They Climbed or any other book, because there's so many books that we use to even write Lifting as They Climb. So how we have a resources section in here, works cited section too. So how do we share these resources to those who, you can tell when certain people say certain things, you know, where their mindset is, and that they have not learned of particular histories, and they have not learned of the impact of Black women throughout history. And so I think one of the greatest things we can do is just share information so that folks can kind of like navigate the world in a different way, and also understand why it's important to respect the legacies and the lives of Black women today. So just the resource share, making sure folks have access to that information, or even just sharing a website link, article, whatever. To me, that's really important. How do we do that? And how do we make sure that these narratives that are often left out by mainstream history books, classrooms, curriculums, how do they then become a part of our learning experiences and the learning experiences of young people who really do need to know that we have always contributed, we have always built, created, absolutely, we've had such a substantial impact on why this nation is what it is today. So sharing that information in order for folks to be able to understand and form those thoughts is so important.
Yeah, so, you know, the Cite Black Women, you know, that's a big hashtag going around, Cite Black Women. And one thing I really want to lift up that you said is just like, this is American history, right? Like, this is our contribution as Black women. We have been here contributing, you know, our blood, sweat, and tears, you know, for generations. And we need to celebrate those people, celebrate our ancestors, and celebrate those that came before us. And also, you know, I'm thinking of Lifting as They Climb, you know, the Black girls, right? So lifting them up, celebrating them, because as you said, a lot of harm happens in the home, right? And all the things, you know, we, especially little girls, the school to prison pipeline, the disciplinary rates, you know, the over adultification of Black girls, like all the things that happen, and showing them that these people that came before them were powerhouses, right? And that and one thing you said earlier is, you know, their mothers, their daughters, their writers, or this, and everyone always wants thinks of activists as, you know, those people that are just standing up on, you know, soapbox preaching. But it's just like, you know, you said, do it in the home, right? Do it with interpersonal relationships. Not everyone's going to be, you know, the one that's going to stand in front of a cop, right? Or not everyone, that's not everyone, not everyone's going to do that. And so, but that doesn't mean you can't make a change on an interpersonal level. So like everything you said is just, I loved it. I'm here for all of it. And so I want to thank you, and I know Anthony was say thank you, but for, you know, ending up, you know, if you want to go get the book, just get the book. We have them. Yes. Go on the website, download, go on the tour. And we want to thank you and Miriam for just putting together this wonderful project and highlighting people that we might not have known about, right? They might have got lost in history. And so it's an amazing thing, and you're creating a very amazing legacy. And then, you know, you all will be in these books too, right?
Ooh,
And I can't wait to see this.
I gotta shout you out on that one. You're gonna be in
these books too,
yeah.
right?
Oh, it's a huge responsibility. I know Miriam is, you know, and I don't think I get to say thank you to her enough for changing my life. You know, she changed my life with the work that she was doing, the research that she was doing, that I was able to be a part of, that has completely changed my whole entire life, and how I think about work, and how I think about organizing, and how I think about how we live our our life experiences, you know, that there's so much possibility, so much breadth that we can cover, so many things that we can do. And that Miriam is an example of that to me, and that these women are an example of that to me, and there's so much inspiration out there that we don't need to feel defeated or upset. And there's so much going on in this world that can make us feel like, how am I going to continue? How am I going to continue? You know, but I think that our history really is that push, and it helps us see like, no, there's a way. And even through what you love to do, it doesn't have to be the labor. You know, it can be what you love, and through that you're creating change. So I'm so grateful. Thank you all so much for having me.
Black women out here changing lives.
Changing lives, past, present, and future. Yes.
Well, I want to thank you. You know, Triple SP and everything like that, you know, we're indebted to you. So yeah, I'm gonna say bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank